Okay. So this was a network project, and we were looking or exploring how we can use materials and information from different types of sources and bridge across the issues of time, where we've got long records, but often in qualitative forms, and sometimes quite often shorter records in quantitative forms, but also a mix of these records. So the project actually attempted to set up a network with the goal of producing a protocol about how we can use such information and bridge across it. So how can we extend our records back in time? So this, as Suraj has said, was part of the UK Climate Resilience Programme, and it was a one-year project, so it's relatively short in that sense, and it's sought to capitalise on our approaches and understanding to historical climatology and hydrological research in the UK, where we can blend these different types of material together. Today, climate resilience often places an emphasis on enhanced and improved climate models or seasonal decadal forecasting capability. But actually, these are often based on relatively short instrumental data sets. And even though I talk short, there can be 100 years, there is the capacity through historical records to take some of these data sets back several hundred years. And there's a number of studies that have done this for different parts of the UK. And the network aimed to adopt the principles of acres and melded approach, which sought to use and blend both qualitative and quantitative information together. And through doing that, we can provide greater understanding of long-term variability, provide better understanding of reconstructions by bringing together the information in the descriptive accounts and produce narrative accounts, which often contain information that involves detail on impacts, variability and extremes that may often not be recorded within relatively short series. Whilst we have long temperature and precipitation series in the UK for many parts, there are many parts of the UK that have still relatively short series that might be 60 or 70 years in length, and therefore they might not contain truly extreme events. Similarly, from a hydrological perspective, the average gauge record is around about 40 to 50 years in the UK. So we have there a record of hydrological events that, again, isn't maybe going to contain the most extreme events. And once you head out into northern Scotland or Wales, those series tend to be much shorter again. So other sources of information provide opportunities to really understand what's actually happening in some of these communities, but also to better understand the nature of these events, the mechanisms that cause them, and that allows us to think about how they might have changed through time, but also to think about how communities have prepared and adapted themselves, the changes or modifications they've made to their environments or their behaviours that might help understand where we're at. So the first step was to establish an interdisciplinary scoping network, and this really was focused around bringing individuals together from different disciplines. So we had people in the network from geography, from history, from engineering, from languages and communication science. We also had colleagues from stakeholders from the Met Office, from climate modelling communities, but also CEPA, the Environment Agency, CH Wallingford. So we had a nice breadth of partners involved in this from the start. And there were also partners from the insurance and consultancy arenas. So the idea was to try and understand how we can improve on the qualitative-quantitative data gap. This space in which we have lots of information, but we're not always utilising that information. We're not using it for the benefit of understanding potential resilience in the UK. And there's a lot of information in there. For those of you that maybe aren't familiar with what this is, it might be the knowledge and experiences contained with it in qualitative data in the forms of books, letters or diaries, which might often include extreme events or, importantly, mundane events. There's been very little study of the importance of mundane. What do I mean by mundane? Well, those periods in between extreme events, whether that's storms, floods, droughts, what's actually happening in those mundane events that shapes how a community, an individual might respond when one of these extreme events happens. If we have long intervals in between extreme events, then we might see a decline in memory or experience, which might be important for a community response. So we get this sort of tailing off or loss of understanding of memory. So there are actions that can be undertaken during those mundane events that may either exacerbate or reduce the risk that an individual or community are exposed to when these extreme events happen. And that might be included within the qualitative information. And we also have existing quantitative information. We're probably more familiar with that often in the form of instrumental data sets, precipitation, temperature, climate modeling, data in the sense of numerical data often, that we might understand or feel we understand better. So this information, it can help improve and sort of support climate service provision. By charting the effects of past climate variability or extreme events, it provides us with opportunities to think about communication of risk to different communities and people, but also thinking about how past adaptation has been undertaken and how that might change the way that we think about future climate resilience. So the objectives of the project were first to identify existing data sets that are used by different organisations and practitioners from the different disciplines. And that's something we were very keen to do, because whilst as a hydrologist or a climatologist, you're probably familiar with certain data sets, you may be less familiar with data sets from other disciplines, or the nature of those data sets, the utility of those, how they're compiled. So the first workshop was actually focused on exploring these different types of data sets and actually drawing a list of these materials together so that we could actually explore why aren't we all using these data sets. Even if you're a historian interested in flooding or climate science, why aren't you necessarily using some of these data sets? What are the limitations of them? What are the drawbacks or elements that fail to provide value to you? And so the first workshop really explored this. The second objective was to try and identify current approaches to bridging across this qualitative-quantitative data divide. And here we sort of had a long discussion around the potential application of indices to qualitative data. So this is where you can simplify or reduce a descriptive text or section of material down to some kind of base indices that's on some kind of numerical scale. And we explored whether there were any new approaches that might be applied to better understanding how we could do this from other disciplines. And that's part of the reason we were so keen to draw on individuals from different disciplines and get them really involved in the project, so we could try and identify new approaches that might be applicable. The third objective, working in consultation with project partners, was to determine mechanisms and forms of data that would be greatest utility to practitioners in the climate resilience field. So here we were particularly involved with CCRA and trying to understand how the outputs of this workshop could be of value to them, but also to the Met Office and others involved in trying to communicate climate change and climate resilience to different organisations or bodies or people that may have different understandings. And the outcomes of this were to produce a protocol that would allow different disciplines to work together to provide a mechanism by which we could communicate more effectively and therefore hopefully provide better understanding to practitioners and stakeholders that provide more historically informed climate services. So I'm going to work through these objectives in a way through the workshops, and the workshops effectively explored those objectives. So we had 3 workshops. The first was a workshop that was held in Liverpool in April 2019 that really sort of explored some of the different types of databases that are used by different disciplines, but also partners, and why and what attracted them to using certain data sets, and why they were maybe less enthused by other data sets that were out there. The second workshop that was held at the Royal Geographical site in June 2019 explored some of the approaches that maybe are available for doing this. So a particular section of this was focused on the use of indices and the potential value of indices as a tool for converting qualitative information into a quantitative information that might be then comparable to more contemporary quantitative data sets. And it also allowed us to explore how we might use that information within the qualitative data to support or reframe some of these methods. So questions about overlapping periods or calibration to extend these records for much longer periods. And the final workshop that was held in the down at the Met Office explored the potential for communication of risk and of application, particularly using qualitative materials, and how we might augment current instrumental data sets with this additional material, and look at the co-production approaches to producing the protocol. And so we had talks from the climate change risk assessment team and a number of other beneficiaries, including the Met Office, but also a number of the presentations looked at how other groups and other communities have been communicating and using historical records, and that included the Met Office, in better understanding climate resilience across a different range group of communities. So in the first workshop, we identified a rather extensive list, actually, of different types of data sets that were being used by different communities. I've briefly sort of bridged them into the climate, weather and hydrological community. So data sets such as Tempest and the chronology of British hydrological events, Tambora, Old Weather, Euroclimhis. I believe the slides will be available online after the talks today. So they're all live links in there. So if you're not familiar with some of these data sets and you're interested, then you can go and explore them. Similarly, within the social sciences, there were other data sets that were being used by individuals working in environmental history, particularly around ideas of landscape change, drainage, and flooding and droughts particularly. And they were exploring data sets such as the London Lives, Welsh Tide Index, the Old Bailey Online, which was a legal archive, mass observation archives, sound archives, newspaper archives, and Stories of Change, which is more focused towards energy, but has sections in there and oral histories on rivers and watercourses. So we managed to compile these two different types of records that were being used by different communities. And we explored why we were using these different data sets. And there was a recognition that we were using and moving across this boundary already. So it wasn't just that the climatologists and the hydrologists were using the top section and we weren't looking at the bottom section. And similarly, the social sciences among the group were using the data sets or the databases in the top section as well, to better understand some of the frequency. And really the reason why the different communities are using these different data sets comes down to what they contain and the utility of them. So quite often the top data sets were of much more value in producing long series, so series that could be used for frequency analysis or looking at temporal changes, where the social sciences materials included much more detail, and they provided context to be provided. And it was that context that was really the key element that was identified in this workshop. So other existing challenges: some of the data sets weren't downloadable, some of them weren't particularly easy to search. Manageability of some of these, some were defined as clunky. Others, there's the lack of a map interface, or the regionalization or the identification of different areas was identified as a challenge sometimes. So they were using sometimes political frameworks. The hydrological data sets used hydrometric areas. Others were focused more on where research projects had really been focused on. Others were more focused towards sources. So there were different mechanisms for how these data sets were framed. And there were questions about who were the stakeholders, who were these data sets designed for. In some cases, online newspapers, for example, is an archive of those newspapers. It can be accessed by a number of different disciplines, whereas something like the chronology of British hydrological events was much more framed towards hydrologists potentially, and was maybe less interested in the context of some of the events that occurred. There's also a recognition that some of these data sets have been built and were continually added to for long periods of time, 20, 30 years in some instances. So some of them had evolved through time and were maybe had reached an end point, where others were continuing to develop. So there's questions about why do we use these data sets around centralization, synergies, ease of comparison, etc. But the limitation was this loss of information and context. I think one of the important things that really emerged from my understanding from this workshop was how we think about data, or whether what we're talking about is often information, and that data actually has a connotation of something that's numerical. And therefore, actually, when we're thinking about sort of how we communicate, just the terms data and information might be used a bit more sensitively and can help us understand that. Well, what do some of these data sets look like? So the top one is Tempest, and you can see here there's a whole range of different parameters that can be identified and can be help you search, including location, place, different types of events. You've got the chronology of British hydrological events down at the bottom, and again that's allowing you to search by hydrological areas or types of events. You've got Tambora, which is a wonderful, huge data set that's hosted out in Germany, but I found quite slow to process through, and others had similar comments. So some of these data sets have vast amounts of information in them, but how do we bridge that issue of merging these data sets? Similarly, from the social sciences, we've got different types of information. So tide maps on land use change that might include information on that, but isn't focused. It's more on what's actually happening in the visual sense. Stories of change, which is about energy. We've got the London Lives Project, which has more of a focus towards poverty, crime, social policy, and those elements, which does include information on the environment, but in different ways, and it's archived in different ways. So we can think about a number of these elements as we work through. The second workshop really explored questions about how we can use some of this information. So how can we use qualitative information? What are the trade-offs between maybe simplifying that information through loss of context? And what does the standardization of some of this information mean? So looking at how different qualitative sources can be simplified down to maybe an index, which might be simply a scale of 1 to 5 based on the extent or extremeness of a record. And some of the challenges around that, and why do we maybe feel uncomfortable sometimes to do that? And quite often within the social sciences, I think we felt that there was a frustration or a limitation that actually the loss of the complexity, the nuance, about the detail, about the broader context, actually lost a lot of the information that was of value here, and actually helped explain why some of these accounts might be interesting. There are also challenges around standardization. What's normal in different regions, even of the UK, is important. So are there challenges about comparability of some of these applications? Can you take something like that's maybe defined as normal in East Anglia and compare it to something in the Outer Hebrides or Northern Scotland? So we have to be very aware of some of this. And there is recognition that we take away the information that's maybe of greatest value in some of these qualitative records by converting them into a quantitative source. So the information that's contained in that lived experience. So we lose some of that emotional impact and context that actually can be really important in communicating. And we identified that actually some of the value of these qualitative records is actually in the storytelling or the public engagement, where people can engage with elements such as the lived experiences of people previously much more easily than potentially the indices or potential figures or extremes or probabilities that were quite often being communicated. And that's really where we took workshop 3. Before I do that, I just wanted to provide an example of what kind of materials we're looking at. And here I've used an example of some work that I did with a former PhD student, Cerys Jones, looking at some diaries from North Wales, so near Bala, in between Bala and Snowdon. And this was from a farm diary that was recorded every day between 1934 and 2000. And it was recorded on a farm. It was in an upland area, And in there is, you can see here that it was predominantly in Welsh, but a mix of Welsh and English. And it recorded basically what was happening on the farm, but also what the weather was like. And there might be 1 or 2 entries each day to record that. And it provided us with a very long time series of information that allowed us a mechanism for reconstructing the weather for an area where the weather records were relatively poor. So there's farm information in there, there's the weather, but also other stuff. So the end of World War II is recorded, the outbreak of World War II, the Queen's coronation. So there's a lot of information that might be used by other disciplines, but was maybe less interesting for us from a climatology perspective. And there's a number of opportunities here to use different scales. So we used a 5-point scale, which I'll show in a minute, but it allows us to think about the daily life of the farm. And we're particularly interested in this instance in reconstructing our understanding of what was actually happening in this upland area of Wales. And there wasn't really much meteorological data available nearby. So we actually used some hydrological records to demonstrate the relationship here between the indices that we were able to generate. So using the table there on the right hand side of the graphs, and you can see that we can quite easily classify some of the weather types and then put that into this information and compare it to the hydrographs for 2 periods of 1976 and 1988. And what I'm trying to show here is that you can actually depict quite nicely the relationships. And there's a paper that one of my current PhD students, a postdoc working on a new project, has just accepted, where we've actually gone through 27,000 records, or Alice has gone through 27,000 records of the weather from the period from the 1780s through to the 1850s. And she's actually been able to show better correlations to indices derived from diaries than through other existent instrumental data sets for parts of Staffordshire when compared to long instrumental series. So there is real value in this. But what I draw your eyes to here is on the bottom graph, the issues around summer thunderstorms. And there was a real issue about how this recorder was identifying, because of importance to the farm, thunderstorms. So whilst the river flows, you can see, are relatively low through the middle of that year, through the summer, the indices were indicating lots of storms. And that's because they were recording thunderstorms that were important to the cattle and the activities of the farm at the time. So there is an importance and awareness of needing to think about who the recorder is. And there's potential sometimes a bias to these types of materials when you've got just a single source. And therefore, in the work that I've just been describing, that will be hopefully published in the next couple of weeks, and I was hoping to include here as an example, you can actually use multiple diaries to overcome some of those bias risks. But being aware of the context is really important. So being aware that he was a farmer, that he was interested in his cattle, allowed us to better understand some of the importance of these thunderstorms, and therefore the importance of those in the diaries. And we can downplay that as a significant element. So we've got historical records. We can extend these into areas such as Snowdonia, where records are relatively short, typically around 50 to 60 years. Often in central England, records are often around 150 years, but we can extend these diaries back right through to the 16th, 17th century. So there's this challenge of how do we bring these sources of qualitative information to engage with the quantitative information? How can we bridge that data type, but also what's the value of this lived experience? And that's where we really explored, and what we really explored in section 3 in the 3rd workshop. So in this workshop, we sort of based down in the Met Office, we explored a number of these elements and thought about how can we use this information to help communicate science policy, but also improve awareness and understanding. And we identified that whilst models and probabilities can provide certain degrees of information, sometimes actually lived experiences or past experience of the locations can provide real value. And particularly where you've got high magnitude events and events that maybe haven't occurred in lived memory, they can be particularly important. And you can actually use and harvest the societal responses to support understanding, but also to facilitate engagement with communities. So if you're going out and talking about risk to communities, using this historical information will be really important for that. And there is a real richness to these records. You can, as I identified, you can head out to areas where few other sources are available, where you can identify these materials and use them for reconstruction. So what were the outputs of this project or this network? The first is a protocol which we're currently working on. We've just sent out a set of questionnaires to everybody that were involved in the workshops. We've asked people to respond to those, and that will help us in some of the framing. We currently have a draft outline to the paper, and some sections are pulled together. And the second part was a network that would allow us to respond to some of these complex issues and sort of come forward in the future, hopefully for future calls, both within this and other programs. So the protocol is currently in process. As I mentioned, we're currently pulling that together. And it's important that we have a protocol of this, that we provide a more rigorous process that will allow greater uptake and use of historical information, recognizing some of the limitations. Why is this important? Well, sometimes these sources are not going to be around forever. That the image down at the bottom is a series of flood marks. This is actually from the Czech Republic, but we've come across examples of this in the UK, where you've got flood marks just being lost through breakdown of materials. We also have challenges about communication of some of these risks. And this is the two slides here, the images, they might look identical, but they're actually different. And the first one's from Bristol Channel flood of 1607. And the second one is actually from Eastern Germany. And I actually presented a talk where I presented the first image as a depiction of the impacts of historical floods and the way that they're narrated. And somebody actually accused me of presenting a German example in this case. So I went back and I actually pulled out the original, and I actually went and found the German equivalent. And here you can see that it's basically been syndicated, but with slight amendments. If you look carefully, you can see that the cows down in the bottom have been replicated or swapped for horses. And the people are actually wearing slightly different hats if you look carefully. And some of the structures are ever so slightly different, and the position of some of these. So it's quite interesting how this information is presented, but we do need to take care sometimes about syndication and extension of these records. Who attended these workshops? We had 47 different participants, over 90 participants in total attended the workshops, representing 28 different organisations. And we started off with an intention that this would be predominantly UK, but we had interest in this from colleagues in the Czech Republic and Vienna, who attended some of the subsequent workshops. And we, I think, produced a very effective network. It was a very broad church, and we welcomed people from different disciplines, and we were really keen to ensure that everybody felt they had the opportunity to speak. And thanks to Kate, who sent through one of the project review comments actually on Friday, which was reflected this view. And I appreciate the project reviewer, whomever that was, for saying that. And they felt that this worked really well. My personal experiences of the networking, I wish I'd made it possible to attend remotely. That's a personal reflection. Something that I felt at the time was probably too technologically demanding, but now I appreciate it much easier than I thought. And the final workshop was held on the election day. We were in the diary first, and everything was booked. Unfortunately, Boris called an election, and that really hit us on some of the attendance, because people couldn't attend because schools were closed, or they felt they had to undertake other activities that day. I am happy to say that the network has provided a subsequent successful project. So we've been able to get an AHRC-led project through building climate resilience with Historic England as a function of this network, and that came out of that network from people that were attending. So that was much appreciated. And I wanted to take this opportunity to just thank everybody that attended the workshops and engaged with them in a very open and free way. And for those of you not familiar, I was just going to finish. I always like a slide at the end where I can talk to it for a minute or two about the different types of materials, just to give people a sense of what is it that I'm talking about here in these kind of materials. From a European perspective, we have lots of flood marks all across Europe. This is from Prague, and you can see the sort of flood marks depicting flood events there. The bottom image is some painted flood marks, and I like this slide because it depicts the transient nature of how these marks are being recorded. So here we've got the 2000 floods, nice and bold painted on. We've got a flood mark from 1982, and you might be struggling to see it, but there's a flood mark from 1978 there. And I like the way the flood mark itself is being eroded away, so that memory is being lost 22 years at the time this picture was taken afterwards. We've got people in the bottom here commemorating floods, the loss of family lives. We've got flood marks. This is actually the only drought mark I'm aware of in the UK, which is on Smeaton's Bridge up in Perth in Scotland, which depicts a very low water level. We've got staged imagery, but you can still see the elevation of the water here from Nottingham in the 1950s. We've got jazz music. So music is often a tool for recording the impacts of floods and droughts and different types. And why is that important? Well, it often records the impacts of these events on communities that maybe don't get recorded in official records. So here I've got a jazz song that records the 1928 floods of the Mississippi. I don't have an image to depict it, but I also have a copy of some country music or country song from Manchester that depicts a flood in the 1870s or 1880s, in which a graveyard's washed out and the bodies are discarded down the river Irwell and Mersey. Here we've got a diary from Cornwall from the sheriff, Kirkwich, who recorded the weather as he travelled around undertaking his duties. So whilst he was catching sheep rustlers, he also recorded whether it's snowing or not. And that's from the 1570s. We've got a flood mark here from Salford on the River Irwell in 1866. And anybody who's familiar with Salford, you walk around this park. This is way above head height, just to give a sense of the scale of this. And this is really important in the sense that this maintains that public memory. So it retains that memory of the impact of that flood and gives people an awareness that actually flood events can happen that are really large. I've got an image up here from a diary, probably the most common type of material that you can use. Newspapers here, an Exeter and Plymouth Gazette recording the 1866 floods. And this was a supplement that was provided. And it records effectively every farm or every homestead that was impacted by that flood. So you can actually map the whole impact of that single flood in its impact all the way through the catchment, which is really nice. And then Perth back in, I think it's 1910. And you can see the big blocks of ice that formed. And Perth's a really nice example because in I think it's 14, the ice actually got stuck under at Smeaton's Bridge and actually built up an artificial almost dam of ice blocks, ice rafts, and it elevated the water level by about 7 meters. So it gives you a sense of the kinds of impacts that can happen. So thank you very much. I'll hand back to Suraj, I think.